Okay guys, welcome back. It's time for our next chapter. And as you can see here, this chapter is called vSAN cluster monitoring. Now let's take a look at this chapter. This is one of those chapters that has several lessons. So when you take a look, we start with the importance page. And you can imagine, of course, it's critical for any sysadmin, for any vSAN administrator, to constantly monitor what's going on. So in this chapter, we are going to talk about how to monitor your vSAN cluster, your vSAN data store, your VMs, and so on. And not only that, we're going to mix the vSphere client also with some commands. So let's take a look at this chapter. This module, you can see, has 3 lessons. The first one is called vSAN Health Monitoring. The second one is vSAN Performance Monitoring. And the last one is called vSAN Capacity Monitoring. Now, as I go through the materials, I'm going to be explaining to you pretty much what you're going to be doing in the labs. And in my demos, I'm going to show you, for example, how to break your cluster. And we're going to do a series of demos where, for example, we're going to create cluster partitions. We're going to have losses when it comes to the disks. So we're going to see how the vSAN cluster reacts. Throughout my demos, I will be using the different clusters, both cluster A and cluster B. So let's start with the first lesson. And again, this lesson is called vSAN Health Monitoring. So when you take a look, here we start not necessarily with Skyline Health. We start by explaining why you may want to consider joining the Customer Experience Improvement Program. After that, we talk about again how to monitor your vSAN cluster. And in particular, we're going to be dealing with the health service, which nowadays is called Skyline Health. I'm going to be combining that with some commands. And if you like the command line, I would suggest that you remember ESX CLI vSAN. Not only that, you may want to remember ESX CLI vSAN and debug, and also ESX CLI vSAN Health. So when you take a look, here they're talking about the Customer Experience Improvement Program. And there's a lot of reasons why you may want to consider joining that program. As you can see here, notice this not only helps us, but it also helps you. Now, when you take a look at the very top, it says the CEIP helps us, aka VMware, improve our products and services by collecting anonymous data from different customers. And notice, the data that we collect is related to how our customers use our products. So you can see again, we collect configuration related data, feature use, meaning what features are our customers using. Not only that, we get performance related information and also information from logs. So when you take a look here, we show you how to join this CEIP. In class, we don't do that. Please, again, don't do that. But in any event, by doing that, not only you're helping VMware, you then also have access to additional features and tools that without it, you cannot use. So having said that, let's talk about this. With the last few versions of vSAN, we always allow our customers to run these proactive tests. Now, in 7X, you have 2 different tests. I'm going to show you these tests in my demo. The first one is called Virtual Machine Creation Test. And what this test will do is it will create temporarily 1 VM for each of your hosts. Within a minute or less, those VMs get created. Then the VMs get deleted, and then you get the results of the test. If you run that test in class, expect that test to pass. Having said that, there is another test. This one's called Network Performance Test. This one, however, will always give you a warning in class because remember, our servers are nested. This one is simply, again, testing the performance of the network. So don't be surprised if you run that one, that you're going to get warnings throughout. But again, typically you run these tests before you put the cluster in production. And if you don't get the results that you expect, maybe it's time to go back to the drawing board, fix whatever issue you may be dealing with or having, and then again, do the test again. Now, when you look at this page, here we introduce the concept of Skyline Health. And I always tell my students that this is your best friend when it comes to troubleshooting your vSAN cluster. We've had this service for a while. We used to call it the health service. It was renamed in 7X. But in any event, the idea is the same. When you have a problem with vSAN, you always want to go here first. Now, the idea is simple. If you see, for example, a red circle, in the old days in the web client, a red diamond, or any type of error or warning, always start by going to your cluster. And from there, go to the Monitor tab. When you go to the Monitor tab, underneath vSAN, select Skyline Health. And you're going to see a series of tests. And again, these tests will tell you whether you're having issues when it comes to the network, whether you're having issues when it comes to your data, your objects, whether you're having issues with cluster partitions. Now, as you can see here, we have a series of tests. And again, at different times, you may see everything in green, which is what you want to see, or potentially don't. Notice there's a section for networking. There's a section for your physical disks, a section for data, a section for clustering, and so on. And in my demo, I am going to show you how we can break the cluster in a variety of ways and how quickly you could ascertain who the culprit is. Now, in this page, here we talk about online health. And if you take a look at the very top, we explain what this is. Notice it says online health includes vSAN Support Insight and also Skyline Advisor. If you take a look here, you have a brief explanation of the two products. First, notice it says vSAN Support Insight helps vSAN users maintain a reliable and consistent compute, storage, and network environment. But for you to use this, as mentioned earlier, you would have to join the CEIP. And when you take a look then, we see a paragraph talking about Skyline Advisor. And notice again, this only works if you have Premier support. But again, the idea here is we try to be proactive when it comes to figuring out what potentially could go wrong and make your life a little easier in the process. So going back to Skyline Health, here you can see, for example, that in this particular scenario, everything looks clean. Now, in this case, we're looking at the test to see whether or not we have a cluster partition. Now, if you notice, everything looks green. That's good. But besides that, when you take a look, as you look at the partition list, you can see that your 4 hosts happen to be on the same partition. If you ever see, for example, 3 servers on partition 1 and a host on partition 2, then that's the guy that happens to be network isolated. He's the one that doesn't see the other 3. And the worst case scenario, of course, would be to have 4 servers in this case and seeing each and every single one of the servers in a different partition. That means you have a total network failure. Now, if you see that type of problem, right? Number one, the question is, did you actually consider perhaps using redundancy throughout? But besides that, you're having a bad day. Now, in that case, none of your VMs will run because, again, you will never have the majority of the votes. So this is what you want to see. Every single host on the same network partition. You can also see here that every host has a unique ID. Now, here you have another example of what you expect to see. And this one is related to networking. So you can see in this case, we're talking about the network latency check. And once again, everything looks clean here. So again, we're trying to show you what we expect you to see. Having said that, in my demos, trust me, you're not going to see everything green. You're going to see things sometimes in yellow and or red. Now, in this case, we're talking about taking a look at your data. Now, in this case, you can see that everything's green. Now, notice carefully the right side. And on the right side, you have two choices there, which happen to be grayed out. The first one is repair objects immediately. We kind of talked about this before. Now, remember, typically you want to use that if, let's say, a host crashes and you know it's not coming back. Remember, when a host crashes, by default, we wait 60 minutes for us to rebuild the data. Now, if you know the server's not coming back in an hour because, let's say, the motherboard is fried, you don't want to sit there for another 15 minutes. Start rebuilding the objects immediately. And then you also have another choice called Purge Inaccessible VM Swap Objects. In the old days, you could only do that with the RVC, the Ruby vSphere console. But over the last few years, VMware has added a lot of bells and whistles to the vSphere client, so you don't have to necessarily rely on that tool called the RVC. Here you have another example. This one, to a point, is self-explanatory. This one is about time synchronization. And once again, as you can see here, every single one of the hosts happens to have the NTP service enabled, and everything looks clean. Now, we've talked about this one as well. And remember, in the old days, we had a feature called proactive rebalance. And the system would always tell you to do a proactive rebalance if the variance when it comes to space utilization was higher than 30% between two different disks, potentially on the same or different hosts. So in this case, you can see everything looks good. So you don't have to do a proactive rebalance. Notice the maximum load variance in this case is 3%. Remember, 30% is the default threshold. If you exceed 30%, unless you have enabled automatic rebalance, the system will give you a warning saying that it would be a good idea to click on that icon called proactive rebalance. And then again, at that point, allow the system to move data around to rebalance space across different disks. Now, if you're going to do that, not a good idea to do that in the middle of the day because you're talking about potentially adding a lot of extra I/O. So this may happen, for example, if you just add a bunch of new drives. The new drives will be empty to begin with. The existing ones may be at 50, 60%. So in that case, the variance is higher than 30%. And if you take a look, we talked about upgrades, and we've mentioned that you want to make sure that every single host has every single drive with the same disk format version. Remember that we talked about if we do an upgrade, in some cases you may have to do a DFC upgrade. Here you can see we have 4 hosts. Once again, everything looks clean. So again, you don't have any disks that were not magically upgraded. Now, this may show something different. If you're doing an upgrade of the DFC and halfway through, perhaps one of your hosts crashes. At that point, the test may fail halfway through. And again, you may have disks that were upgraded and other disks that were not. And if you take a look, this is very important. Now, when you take a look here, we can see that all the advanced parameters of every host when it comes to vSAN happen to match. And that's what you want to see. Now, if you take a look, here you see that you have a match when it comes to, again, parameters such as the object repair timer, side read locality, and so on. Now, if you take a look, you could change some parameters on the command line, let's say, or with the vSphere client. So, for example, there is a parameter. I'm going to show you this in the demo, but there is a parameter that, for example, allows me to dictate how big a component could be. If I was going to change that, you want to change it in every host. If I only change it in one host out of 4, let's say, the system eventually will complain that I have advanced parameters out of sync. So that would be, again, a typical warning. And the way you fix it, again, is you start by looking at Skyline Health. And if you take a look, once again, here, you have another example. This one's related to capacity. And here, you can see it says VMware Skyline Health vSAN component utilization. This check examines component utilization for the entire cluster. And if you take a look, it says it displays a warning or error if the utilization exceeds 80% for the cluster or 90% for any host. So once again, in this case, everything looks good. Remember, we've mentioned several times the concept of slack space. So if you're exceeding 80% of the space when it comes to the cluster, it may be time to perhaps grow the cluster or potentially migrate VMs elsewhere if you can. So when you take a look, here you have another test that in the old days could only be performed with the Ruby vSphere console. Notice again, this one is called, what if the most consume host fails? Meaning, what would happen if one of your servers just crashes? When it comes to space, would you be out of space or not? And once again, in this case, you can see you're not even remotely close to running out of space. So when you take a look, this is just nothing more than a quick intro to Skyline Health. Remember, in my demo, I am going to show you all sorts of examples. And again, the demo will be extensive because again, this is one of the most important things. Also do remember, we do have an entire vSAN troubleshooting class that all of us at VMware teach. And again, that's a pretty cool class. In that workshop, first we lecture, and then you run scripts, and those scripts magically break your cluster. It's going to be up to you in that class to figure out exactly what the script did. And again, those scripts emulate real life. Thank you guys, and I'll see you when we do the demo. Thanks.